let me welcome everybody to season 4 of the speakers series. When we started this, it was kind of a fill-in for the COVID shutdown for everything, and gave us an opportunity to still see each other and share research and do those sorts of things. And it's taken on a life of its own, and here we are doing it again. We are thrilled to see all the familiar names who have returned, and good to see a couple of new names. We hope you will stay with us as we go through this year's program. In the last newsletter, I think we republished the schedule for the rest of the year. But if anybody needs anything, just send me an email and I'll be glad to give you dates or who's ever speaking and that sort of thing. Well, let's get started with tonight's program. Tonight's speaker is a familiar face for the 19th Century Speakers Series. He's presented several times in previous series, as well as presentations at the Fred, numerous articles on Canadian and North American baseball history, and other SABR publications. Bill Humber joined the Canadian Hall of Fame in 2018 and was appointed to the Order of Canada, about 2-3 years ago. This is an award that recognizes Bill's contribution that has made a major difference to Canadian thought through his lifelong contributions to the understanding of baseball in Canada. And as I understand from conversation earlier, they're going to have the ceremony coming up here in a few weeks or months. For over 40 years, Bill has been was a member of the faculty of Seneca College, dealing primarily with environmental education issues. He has also published over a dozen books, including Cheering for the Home Team, Diamonds of the North, and All I Thought About Was Baseball, something dear to the heart of all of us. His presentation tonight is An Unheralded Ancestry, Baseball's Missing Chapter. So, Bill, if you want to pull up your slides, and we'll get started.
There it is. Share is now loading, and we should be loaded. Are we there?
Yep. Yeah, if you see down the bottom of your screen there, there's a little icon next to the slide bar. That hit that and you get a full screen.
Okay.
It's to the left of the slide bar. It's a square with a little line coming out of the bottom of it.
Oh.
Like a podium.
Yeah.
No. No. Okay.
If we can't, we'll just go where we are.
I don't know why it's so you say it's in the bottom left-hand corner?
It's bottom right.
Oh, bottom right. I'm sorry.
By the slide bar, there's a square with a little podium stand underneath it. Just click that.
A square with a podium.
Well, it's a little plus. It looks like a plus sign to those with us that bad eyesight.
Oh.
Because there's a percentage, then the slide bar plus, and there's a minus on the left-hand side. And
yes, I see it. I see it now.
Next icon.
I see it now. Okay.
Just click that, and you should go to click that little. There it is. Now click that, and you should go to full screen.
No.
Yeah, right there. Just click it.
There we are. That it?
There you are. Magic.
Good. Excellent. Good. And I now control the means, do I?
Yes, you can move backward, forward, and
wonderful.
All sorts of strange things.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you for those who've tuned in tonight. As Bob mentioned, this is something I've been working on for quite a long time. In fact, I found an article from 1975 I'd written to the Toronto newspaper saying, responding to somebody who had said, baseball is American culture at its worst, and we should not be encouraging Major League Baseball to come here. And I wrote a letter back and said, no, baseball is American culture at its best. I'm going to kind of expand that thought tonight and say baseball is North American culture at its best. My point, and I guess I'm challenging some perspectives here, not so much to say that they're wrong, but just to say that in many respects, they're incomplete. So I would argue, number one, baseball entered Canada largely, but not exclusively from the United States, but it did so not as an American developed sport or import, but as an English European folk game, analogous to the way Christmas celebrations based on British and European traditions first came into the Canadas from the United States. Baseball is thus a shared North American developed sport, not a solely American one, later exported to Canada. Its origins owe more to regionalism, i.e. the enthusiasm and modern experimentation within distinct places, rather than a New York-centric one. So I'm going to deal with a lot of those kinds of issues tonight, and I appreciate your feedback. First of all, I put this slide up here, not to show what the flag of Ontario, and Ontario, for those who are unfamiliar with it, is basically one of 10 Canadian provinces and 3 territorial governments. Ontario is the largest populated province in Canada. It is essentially north of Michigan, Ohio, and New York State. This flag is not the flag of Ontario from the 19th century. This is today's Ontario flag. It is resplendent with the Union Jack in the upper left-hand corner and the Cross of St. George above the maple leaves. So this kind of English-British heritage remains a significant aspect of Canada, particularly Ontario, to this day. And it is one of the reasons I argue and disagree, I guess, with some perspectives which say that cricket failed in the United States because of its /English-British heritage. If cricket was going to fail anywhere, it would not have failed in Ontario because of British-English heritage. It would have flourished here, but it did not. And it did not because baseball proved to be the better sport in many respects, both from a spectator point of view, certainly with the 90-degree distribution of fans around the diamond. It's an easier game to watch than cricket. It has many other aspects. It generally results in a result, unlike cricket, which can have multiple draws, as they're called, which means not a tie, but in cricket terms, it essentially means no result, which after potentially 5 days of watching can be rather discouraging for the fan. The final feature, I think, is that baseball has 4 bases. Cricket has 2 bases, and therefore there's a lot more action on the diamond in a baseball game. And finally, from a participant point of view, there's a lot more opportunity for people to be engaged in the game on a continual basis in baseball. So I put that out there to say that why then did cricket fail in Canada and baseball prospered? Well, in some respects, I argue that baseball that came into the Canada from the United States, and not exclusively, as I'll show from the United States, owes really more to its European English origins. The game had not developed as an American game when it came in the late 18th, early 19th century. It was still essentially a European English game, much like cricket, Christmas, which of course went through a similar kind of evolution. The Father Christmas you see on your left is the Father Christmas of the 18th century. The Santa Claus on your right is the Santa Claus we know so well, but the guy in the middle is a Santa Claus from as late as 1860. He is not the kind of character you would wish to have to come down your chimney, yet he was still in many respects a carryover from the European English model of a Father Christmas, who only gradually transferred into the Father Christmas or the Santa Claus we know today. Baseball was well embedded in the game throughout the 19th century. This is just an example from Quebec, an early French language version of the rules of baseball on the right. This is actually from a a Quebecois, or Quebec-based binder that a student would have had in school, a scribbler as it was called. So the territory I'm interested in looking at is this piece of southwestern Ontario. And if you look at the map, to give you some idea of where everything sits here, Niagara Falls in the bottom right-hand corner, that's next to Buffalo, New York. London, Ontario, you go down the road 100 miles or more, and you reach Windsor and ultimately, of course, Detroit across the river. But the map does show Toronto in the upper right-hand corner, Hamilton, Guelph, the tremendous baseball center of Canada, this Ingersoll, Beachville, Woodstock area, and some other places which I will cover in my talk. So one of our earliest baseball indications or accounts is this account, which appeared in an 1860 Montreal newspaper, and amazingly, I find it amazing, describes a game that was played for the British Duke, the Duke of Kent, who arrived here in 1792 in what is the Niagara region of southern Ontario, next to Buffalo. And it's an extraordinary account in many ways. When I first read it, I said, well, obviously they've made a mistake. They really meant lacrosse. And that may indeed be the case. The problem with that is that by 1860, the difference between baseball and lacrosse would have been well known. It would have been certainly better known than it would have been in 1792. And the first lacrosse matches between European descended and American descended settlers and First Nations people or Native Americans occurs in 1844. So already there was a heritage of lacrosse being played in certainly in the Canadas, so that an account from 1860 which said baseball, well, possibly. I mean, that's all I could say. The Duke of Kent, by the way, both his father and his grandfather played baseball, which if you look at that year 1792, you're probably going, what? Well, the Duke of Kent's father was George III, who was in an account by Mary Lapel, was said to have been playing with his father in 1748. And his father, in turn, or the Duke of Kent's grandfather, was the Duke of Wales, who was playing baseball in a news account from 1751 and who died before he came to the throne. The Duke of Kent, by the way, is the father. He was the fifth in line after his many brothers and sisters, but his descent was his daughter, who became Queen Victoria. Just a little pointless aside. Now, 1803, we have accounts, one that's written at the very time in Toronto of playing ball. The brother-in-law of Eli Plater. We have another account many years later from a 14-year-old witness of a ball game that was played in 60 miles east of Toronto in the Port Hope area. We have this extraordinary account from 1819. Now, many people focus on the 1838 Adam Ford described game in Beachville, but I think this is a more significant account. It's from 1819. It was in a Hamilton newspaper. It owes nothing to the later Adam Ford account. Undoubtedly, neither of the two writers of these accounts knew anything about the other. This account appeared in about 1874 in Hamilton and talked about the old style of baseball, but every aspect of the game, the 4th of June being Militia Muster Day, the celebration of King George III's birthday, ideally matches the Adam Ford description of the game played in 1838. And if we wanted one further proof that baseball was being played in a fairly high level, or at least a significant level in Canada at the time, is this account from a newspaper in 1838 about a murder in a baseball game in Lower Canada, which is Quebec, which of course is some distance from this, but just shows the considerable distribution of the game at the time. This extraordinary account actually is from the Mackenzie's Gazette. And William Lyon Mackenzie was a noted, well, for want of a better term, radical in Upper Canada who staged a very failed rebellion in 1837, 1838 and 37, 38 and escaped to the United States only to produce his own newspaper, Mackenzie's Gazette. So Mackenzie, who escaped in 1837, eventually went on to return to Canada many years later and became the first mayor of Toronto. So intriguingly, the first mayor of Toronto is the first guy in a newspaper to write about baseball. I include these two descriptions because one is the Adam Ford description on the left. The other is from the George Moreland's Old Time Diamond in his book, 1914 book. And they are different enough to suggest that one did not copy the other. It's sometimes said that, well, wait a minute, Adam Ford was 7 when he watched a game in Beachville in 1838. But a key point of Adam Ford's letter is that he says he played baseball when he returned from college. This would be in the late 1840s, early 1850s. And as a young man, he would have played the same game he would have seen in 1838. And his basis for drawing this picture many years later in 1886, I'm convinced, was based on his play of the game in Ontario in late 1840s. He claims that he was watching the New York game in the late 1840s, early 50s, but that's impossible. The New York game was hardly even based, strong enough in New York City, much less reaching out as far as Ontario by that point. So he's obviously confused his years. He played well into the 1860s, and so that's the period when he would have played the New York game. The final one, and this is the one that I found most exciting when I found this a couple of months ago, was this account from the Huron Gazette in Goderich on Lake Huron. And it's an account from 1848, and it talks about the amusements of the day in 1848. And you can read it for yourself. It said it consisted of cricket, that old spelling of baseball quoits, foot racing, and many other games peculiar to Merry England. And there's a term and a description that really fits some of the descriptions of baseball that David Block has talked about in terms of baseball in England in the 18th century, at least the word baseball as it appears. And so here we have one from 1848, which could suggest that in fact, the early game of baseball not only came up with early settlers into Ontario, but also came directly from the British Isles as well. So we have multiple experiments going on in Ontario. And to me, there's a sure sign of the strength of the regional character of baseball. The fact that you're playing different styles of the game, you're experimenting with different ways to play the game, the fact that you have an organized style to it. The box score on the left from the game in London, Ontario, is from 1856 and was sent to the New York Clipper. The box score below, perhaps the most primitive box score I've ever seen, was from Hamilton in 1858. And the only conclusion I can make from this box score is it was a 5-inning game. And in fact, the game in Hamilton became the game in Woodstock. And on that account, on the right hand of baseball in Woodstock in 1860, it clearly says they played a 5-inning game. So here we have 2 games being played in Ontario, one in the upper left-hand corner with 9 aside. It's always possible. Not everybody showed up and they played with 9, but I have to take it at face value, and only 2 innings. The one below shows what is a 5-inning game, and it replicates what was being played in Woodstock, where the game had been passed on. And here are the 2 accounts from Woodstock in 1860, which confirm that 11 aside game as it was being played in Woodstock and Hamilton in those days. By this date, by the way, 4th of August, 1860, the people in Hamilton had already switched, as they had the year before, to the New York rules game. So they had seen it to be a better and more improved version of what they were playing. And so it was the game that would take off and be the basis of the first ever international baseball game played in, of all places, Niagara Falls, Canada, in August of 1860, between a team from Buffalo and one from Hamilton. This is the first record we have of the New York game. Again, it's from the New York Clipper. Thank you. We can just, Canadian historians can be so thankful for the New York Clipper. Without it, our story would be only half complete. And this was a game played in Hamilton. Many of these guys never show up again. In fact, the only 2 that do are on the young Canadian team from Toronto. F. Schrader is a pitcher in one of the early international games between a Hamilton team and the Buffalo team. And J.F. Jameson in the bottom is John Jameson, forms the first baseball team in Toronto in 1859, undoubtedly playing by the New York rules. But then he disappears into the United States and filing a peripatetic route through the United States over many years. Martin Lacoste and myself had fun trying to track where these people went and where they came from. An significant number of them were actually German-born, and they were virtually all tobacconists or cigar makers. I don't know what that means. It may mean that people who smoke cigars really liked the nature of baseball, but it's an extraordinary record of people who smoked cigars and sold cigars. L. Sievert, who, for instance, who plays on the young Canadian team, lived in Toronto until he died in 1918. I really hope to find him at the game where Babe Ruth hit his home run in 1914, but I wasn't able to do it. It would have been a wonderful connection. So we have organized teams in Hamilton in 1854, another team in Hamilton in 1855. The game is well established. William Shuttleworth on the left is kind of the key organizer behind all of this. But the first great teams are in Woodstock, Ontario, having played by their own rule, the Canadian rules, as it were, with 11 aside in 1860. By 1861, they too had switched over to the New York game. And many of these people are prominent in baseball throughout the entire 1860s as Woodstock Young Canadians, as they were called. There's about 3 teams in Ontario around this team period called the Young Canadians, which can make tracking them somewhat of a challenge for the historian if you're not quite sure which one they're referring to. But these Young Canadians were the local baseball team in Woodstock. It says 1859. I found no indication of that they were playing in 1859. It doesn't mean that they weren't. It just means I could find no indication of it. First indication I have of them playing is in 1860. And in 1864, the separate nature of baseball in Canada from the United States is most pronounced by this advertisement for a grand international match at Rochester, Canada versus the United States. And unlike last Sunday's basketball game, for those who watched it, in this one, the Americans quite outdid the Canadians, 75 runs to the poor Canadians. I can't even see it on my screen here, but they didn't score a lot. It was largely because of their second inning of 21 runs. It was the Brooklyn Atlantics, and they could draw from a community or a metropolitan area of hundreds of thousands of people. The Woodstock Canadians, on the other hand, could only draw from their own community. In fact, down the street or down the road 10 miles from them was Ingersoll, and they would not have thought of sending anyone to support the poor Woodstock Young Canadians. They were a good team, but they simply weren't of the class of the Brooklyn Atlantics. They were a community of 4,000 human beings. Obviously, they had a limited basis to draw upon. And they were the dominant team and totally Canadian or British born throughout the entire 1860s, as were the Hamilton teams of the 1850s. And they were challenged by their neighbors, their good neighbors from Ingersoll, Ontario, who had a few days of tremendous glory in the 1868 year. They not only created a 7,200-pound block of cheese, which they were so proud of, they sent to the, and first of all, I should point out that they had a poet laureate in town who might be the worst poet that ever lived, James McIntyre. Here he says, all gaily dressed, soon you'll go to the great provincial show to be admired by many a beau in the city of Toronto. Oh, God, that's awful poetry. But James McIntyre produced multiple poems, 2 of which were on baseball. So we know that he was a fervent follower of Ingersoll. The Ingersoll Victoria is obviously named after the Queen. Not only did they have the world's worst poet, but they also have the biggest block of cheese, which in celebration of, they sent it to Saratoga, New York. And it was such a big hit there, it went off to England and to Europe to advertise the glory of cheese in Ingersoll. But in 1868, they won the championship of Canada, i.e. they beat Woodstock. And in the little account that appears on the left, it says, the attendant honors have been transferred from the hands of the Young Canadians to the hands of the victorious, who will, we have little doubt, be able to hold on to it for all time. Well, they held on to it for 10 days. They foolishly let Woodstock back into the tournament, as it were, to compete against them. It was a challenge competition, obviously, in their city. They lost the game and they'd never be champions again. But for 10 days, they lived on top of the world. And I like to think that those are the 10 best days of history in Ingersoll's history itself. And you can see they held a baseball concert. I'm sure the world's worst poet showed up, and they sang "God Save the Queen." Aren't they lovely people? So by the 1870s, baseball laurels are passing from Woodstock and Ingersoll to Guelph, Ontario. And this is the Guelph Maple Leafs of 1870 from the Canadian Illustrated News. They're all either Canadian or English born. They have these fancy new uniforms. They are winning. They had won the championship in 1870, and they will maintain that championship until 1875. They will be the first team, and it isn't until 1872, to import an American ball player, and that will be Sam Jackson, who had played briefly with the Boston Red Stockings and ostensibly came to Guelph as they were trying to rationalize in the newspapers to run a store to sell sporting goods. If you buy that, this is the old proverbial, I'll sell you a bridge somewhere. Yeah, sure, he got the concession to sell goods, baseball goods in Guelph, but really his purpose was to improve the lineup of the Guelph Maple Leafs and ensure that they would continue to go on to further glories. By 1871, they were challenging the forest cities of Rockford, and it was a close game. Forest City beat the Maple Leaf only 13-12. But you'll notice something about the Forest Cities, other than the fact that Cap Anson is in the lineup and Bob Addy. You'll notice that there's only 8 players for Forest City. They showed up in town minus one of their players. So Cherokee Fisher, their pitcher, effectively became the ninth batter out, as it were. So every one of his at bats, other than his own at bat, was considered. He was considered an out, and so he shows those 8 at bats. Even though, of course, he probably didn't at bat 8 times. He simply became the designated out. I don't know. Maybe it's a position in baseball for the designated out, but Cherokee Fisher was. And it was a close, tight game. The crowd, the description of the crowd is quite amazing. It was claimed that up to 10,000 came. I doubt that. But the description of the game in many ways would be followed many years later by other descriptions of baseball in Canada. And really it kind of captures the spirit of it. Zane Grey would write a short story about baseball in Guelph. And in some ways, he captures that essence of the good-looking, common-looking, and queer-looking folks who made their way to the playground. And apparently the story was the train broke down 8 miles from Guelph, and many of the people, including so many pretty girls, made the long walk to Guelph to see this baseball game on what is Canada's birthday, Dominion Day, July 1st, 1871. And there are the immortal Forest Cities with Cap Anson, barely beating them 13-12, but keeping in mind they only had 8 players in their lineup. By 1874, George Sleeman, the owner of the team and in the center of this picture, is taking this team to the Watertown World, one of the big baseball tournaments of the day. It's a lovely description in the right upper left-hand corner. In the 5th inning, the Dominions, that would be Guelph, scored 4 runs, and the Negro haters received their usual whitewash. The Negro haters were the Ku Klux Klan Club of Oneida, New York, and they were playing in this tournament against the Guelph Maple Leafs, and the box score appears there. But it's such a. I just thought it was such a great description. The Dominions beating the Negro haters. And George Sleeman, as I say, owned and managed this team. Billy Jones, who's in the third guy from the left in the top row, fascinating character himself. We were able to track him. He was originally a guy named Bill Silkworth from Brooklyn, New York, and somehow ended up in Guelph as Billy Jones, changed his name, changed his identity. And it was only a couple of years later, in fact, 2 or 3 years later, that he was found out to have actually been who had actually left Brooklyn, possibly under conditions of having broken a few laws and gone to play in another city. I've forgotten which one it was now, Ithaca, I believe, but it could have been Utica, and eventually ended up playing in Guelph for the Maple Leafs in this tournament in 1874. And this lineup is beginning now to be staffed by American and basically Canadian professionals. In some way or other, they were all being paid. This is, of course, the great baseball team of London, the 1877 London Tecumsehs, which win the International Association. I think the International Association is unfairly disparaged by history. It was a failed attempt to establish a different kind of league, different than the franchise caste system. I call it a caste system that eventually developed in baseball, with a strict separation between major and minor leagues. The International Association was open to a lot of different kinds of members. Even San Francisco had applied for membership, though how they would have played in the league in those days is beyond me. Undoubtedly, they wouldn't have played. And the International Association, I think in some ways, gets confused with the later International League. But I regard the International Association as the culmination of the development of baseball in southwestern Ontario, the attempt to place it on a level comparable to what it was in the United States, that had gone through this remarkable process of proto-baseball development, early modern development, early independent development, and was ready by 1877 to assume its place in the larger world of Major League Baseball, whatever that term might have meant in 1877. And it didn't succeed. By the end of 1878, Guelph was gone at the end of that year. London were gone in 1878 and ceased to exist. And so in many ways, it's kind of a failed league that perhaps owed too much to the model of the National Association. But I like to think that maybe if given time, they might have evolved towards something closer to what we associate with European soccer, where you have the pyramid system, where teams can move up and down through leagues. Wouldn't it be great if the Brooklyn Cyclones or the Dunedin Blue Jays could, over the years, move up to the major leagues? That's my romantic view of baseball, following a European English soccer model. It's not preposterous. In fact, there was a story in the New York Times just last weekend, 2nd of September, and they said this: ultimately, college football may resemble English soccer, with promotion, relegation, and a handful of marquee teams trading spots each year at the top of the table. So preposterous possibilities are not beyond the realm of the possible. It didn't happen. And so by the next decade, the 1880s, it's the minor league system is beginning to emerge. But one of the great proponents of a team in Canada coming into the National League was Albert Spalding. And he was quite a proponent of baseball in Canada. In fact, he wrote, if you've read The National Game, you'll know that he says a lot of very admirable things about baseball in Canada. His company even allowed the translation, as you can see on the left, in 1912, of the Spalding baseball rules into the Mi'kmaq language. And if anybody can pronounce that Eltimage at the top there, you're a better person than myself. But in 1886, it might all have been a different story that we'd be telling today. Lemuel Felcher, chairman of the grounds and the executive committee of the Toronto Baseball Club, thinks that admission to the National League is a little premature at present. Stupid idiot. All of baseball history and the history of baseball in Canada might have changed as a result of that. And so why in 1886 was Lemuel of such a mind? Well, we see this story in the New York Times just 2 years later He was arrested this afternoon on a warrant charging him with fraud. The complainant is a Mr. Benjamin Palmer from New York, and his losses were there. So Mr. Felcher had something other than Major League Baseball in his mind. So minor league ball in Toronto and Hamilton in particular starts around 1886, lasts for up to 1890, disappears for a number of years until 1895, and then Toronto settles in, having had the chance for Major League Baseball as early as 1886, settles into a long minor league baseball history, as replicated, as shown by this beautiful, I think, program from 1939, purporting to be the baseball centennial, of course, in Old Maple Leaf Stadium in Toronto. And that's where, at the end of the day, this young fella in 1958, wearing his faux Toronto Maple Leafs uniform and holding his hand somewhat high on the bat, is attempting, as wee Willie Keeler would do, to hit the ball where they ain't. And you can see the young catcher in the back. It was obviously a ball that was thrown. That's why he didn't swing at it. That young fellow is yours truly, Billy Humber, at the plate as an 8-year-old in 1958. Well, that is my tale of baseball in Canada. So let me conclude by then saying, why did baseball's story not unfold in this kind of more expansive fashion that I've tried to put across tonight? Why do we not get a more fulsome? Now, in some ways, that's because historians generally have been American baseball historians, and they've focused on the American side of the story. Harold Seymour's books on baseball have very little or nothing. They have a little bit to say, but not very much about baseball across the border. It's almost as if it didn't exist. But the real problem in my mind is what I call lazy Canadians. And I'll read a little bit to prove, hopefully, my point. It starts with responding to Jose Batista's playoff home run and subsequent bat tossing against the Texas Rangers in 2015. Globe and Mail columnist, journalist Marcus G. declared, "Baseball is not, of course, the most Canadian of sports, but oddly, it has made us come together. It's merely one of the latest examples of Canadians treating baseball's history and their generational play and affection as one long example of bowing down to Babe Ruth." A letter writer to the Hamilton Evening Times in 1865 said, "Baseball is fast becoming a Canadian as well as an American game." Even this profession of a sympathetic Canadian identification with baseball had disappeared by the 1880s, when an English-Canadian commentator, Goldwin Smith, wondered if lacrosse and cricket had a chance against Yankee baseball. "The loyal Englishman," he wrote, who regards with pensive regret the adoption of a Yankee game, may console himself with the thought that cricket and baseball have apparently evolved from the same infantine British sport." Wasn't far off the mark on that one. A 1907 PhD thesis, The Americanization of Canada, went further. It cautioned that baseball is becoming the national game of Canada instead of cricket. It has a very deep significance, as has the fact that the native game of lacrosse is not able to hold its own against the southern intruder. In 1927, Robert Eyre trumped even this assertion. In the country's leading intellectual journal, the Canadian Forum, he said, "When Canadian children bowed down to Babe Ruth, they demonstrated Canada's integration into the American empire." By 1962, with its two remaining minor league teams, Toronto and Vancouver, as well as the game's play at the Sandlot amateur level in severe decline, a cover story in the Canadian publication Liberty wondered, can American baseball manager Charlie Dressen save Canadian baseball? Not said was the apparent inability of Canadians to do so. The minor league Toronto Maple Leafs actually outlived Dressen, who died in 1966, the ball team leaving town after the 67 season. In 1990, describing the attendance of U.S. President George Bush I at a ball game in Toronto's Sky Dome, Lawrence Martin in the Toronto newspaper wrote, "The fantastic success of baseball north of the U.S. border was yet another sign of the times. Major League Ball now enjoyed charter membership in English Canada's new continentalist culture, in sports as in music, film, and books. It was a culture less conscious of borders. Even a Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, in his otherwise excellent book on early hockey, a great game, written about 10 years ago, assumed baseball's identity as the American importation. And there, folks, I rest my story.
Bill, thank you very much.
welcome.
If you would, there you go. If you close out your slides, you are. So if you want to see everybody, folks, just go to the gallery view up in the right.
I'm here.
We've got a couple of comments and questions. Gary Gillette, early on, first wanted to let you know that when you were talking about the game in the north, we wanted to let you know that Detroit, parts of Detroit are north of Ontario, or parts of Ontario are south of Detroit. One way or another, it's he's trying to show off his geographical knowledge.
Well,
but he also had
just to that point, we talk in Canada about the 49th parallel, yet most Canadians live south of the 49th parallel.
What, the longest undefended border or something of that nature? Yeah. There's Gary made a comment on the earlier you talked, a nice analysis of the relative merits of cricket and baseball and why baseball prospered while cricket faded in North America. Eric Miklich had a question. Is lacrosse the official sport of Canada?
No, it was, many people thought it had been declared the national game of Canada around 1867, but it was never brought into law. And so in good Canadian fashion, about, I guess, 10 or 15 years ago, it was felt that we needed to declare a national game in Canada. And clearly that had to be hockey. So they came up with the Solomonic, I guess we can call it, decision to declare lacrosse the summer game of Canada and hockey the winter game of Canada, which in my mind still leaves the spring for baseball and the fall for any number of different games you might want to include.
Well, we'll follow that very closely to make sure see how that evolves. A question about the you made a comment that some of those very early references to baseball in Canadian papers and journals and whatnot. I think you commented that some of it you can kind of trace the way David Block did, that you've got elements of baseball from England coming into Canada and elements of baseball from America coming into Canada perhaps a little later. How did that evolve, and did one take over the other?
Well, I would argue that the baseball that came into Canada from the United States did so in the very earliest days of settlement in Southern Ontario in the late 1790s, early 1800s. And when it came in, it was not an American game. It was not the American game of baseball. It was an English, European, custom folk game of baseball that drifted into the country, much as I would argue it's the same with Christmas. Christmas became Americanized, one might say, starting in 1823 with Clement Moore's The Night Before Christmas, right through the Santa Claus of Coca-Cola. But that was a slow process. And until then, really, I think in the key years with baseball in terms of its modernization are what SABR refers to as the proto-modern period, which is really hard to pin down. I mean, we really don't know, basically when that starts, when we start moving away, as it were, from the European English form of or influences of baseball into the game as we know it today. But that process was going on in Canada simultaneously to its going on in the United States, I would argue. And indeed, the June 4 games are an example of human agency driving the playing of games on a specific date associated with Militia Muster Day, not any old folk custom or anything else that was going on. And so they're really one of the early examples of a proto-modern character to what would eventually become modern baseball as we know it today.
Thank you. Gary wanted to make one more point. He says he's not trying to show off his geographic knowledge, but I am sitting on our 17th floor condo looking across the Detroit River at downtown Windsor to my south.
Yes.
uh, uh, Karen Holland, do you think that Americans create a mystical background for their players?
Well, we all mystify our games. I mean, Eric will appreciate this story. About 15 years ago, a researcher from Quebec and two from Sweden showed up at a Society for International Hockey Research meeting in Toronto and claimed that hockey really had its origins in Europe and particularly in England. And the only thing that prevented it from becoming modern hockey as we know it was the end of the Little Ice Age period. And the fact that Toronto, or at least Canada itself, in northern United States has good hockey weather. The old joke being that Winnipeg has 2 months of bad skating and the rest is a great hockey season. And so they were almost drummed out of the meeting for making that argument. But most people now accept that the origins of games are a lot more complex and a lot more widespread than we generally have thought in the past. And we get easily caught into kind of, for want of a better term, patriotic. And let me give you one quick one from today. I watched the England play Scotland soccer match, and they proudly indicated that this was the 150th celebration of the first ever international soccer game. Now, if you follow Jerry Gillette and our geographers will know, England and Scotland are part of the same country. You can, and I know for soccer purposes, they are allowed to have separate teams, and there's a lot of history as to why that is. But to call that the first international game is, in my mind, is a stretch. What is the first international soccer game? Who do you think played it? Can anybody take a guess who played the first ever international soccer game?
Canada and the U.S.
Bingo, thank you. 1885 in New Jersey. Yeah,
Ah.
your hometown, Bob, New Jersey. Yeah.
Woody Ecker made a comment on lacrosse being the summer sport. He said in high school in Baltimore circa 1960, lacrosse was the big spring sport, not baseball. So maybe there's something else going on there.
What saved lacrosse in Canada? The field game died. It was gone by the 1930s. And what saved it was the box game. They moved indoors and they played in hockey arenas. And so the game that's played in Canada now is the indoor box lacrosse game. The game that's played at the universities in the United States is the field game. And so the World Field Lacrosse Championships are invariably won by the United States because that's the game that they're most familiar and most comfortable playing. The box game is the game that's played in Canada now.
Gary Gillette also added that I think that by the 1960s, high school baseball had faded so much in the Northeast that it wasn't the big spring sport in many places. Some high schools no longer had baseball, and I believe that soccer was the big spring sport at his high school in Pennsylvania. My high school, it was a fall sport. Nobody came to the games because they all went to the football games. And Eric notes that lacrosse is still very big today in Maryland. I think, isn't Johns Hopkins one of the powerhouses?
Yeah. Syracuse is another. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a number of schools now that in the ACC and in the upstate New York and New England that play. A lot of high schools in the Northeast are
well,
playing.
it's the greatest field lacrosse player of all time is still considered by many to be Jim Brown, the football player.
Yeah, well, at least the best known.
Yeah.
You had the Gates too. Don't forget, Bill, Gary and Paul Gate.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Bill, thank you very much. There's several folks that left praise for the presentation. They enjoyed it very much, and we enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much for taking the time and making the presentation. Let me touch your calendars a little bit. On Thursday, 2 days from now at 8 p.m., there's another 19th Century Zoom meeting. This is a part of the book club discussion where Kevin Kreiner is going to lead a discussion on a sporting time, New York City and the rise of modern athletics, 1820 to 1870. You can like this, a link will be sent out that morning or the afternoon before that you can tie into. All are welcome to come. Next month, we have Jack. You're up next month, aren't you? Jack Davis?
Yeah. Yep. I was muted there. Sorry. Yeah, I am up
Okay.
next month.
Okay, the speaker series on the second Tuesday of October, Jack Bales will present on Lewis Meacham, a name you may or may not remember, but he was a newspaper man in Chicago and was very supportive of Hulbert's efforts to form the National League and to develop the Chicago club. And we've been having exchanges for the last 9-10 months.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
On things he'd find, we'd discuss them a little bit, but there was all sorts of questions about Meacham growing up. He's listed as on Find a Grave as buried in 2 places. They did not put ashes in different places.
Yeah, right.
And his Civil War
Right.
record, which he enlisted under a false name, if I
Yes. He did.
but anyway, it's a very interesting sort of thing. And then his contribution to baseball through his work, I think it was the Tribune.
Tribune. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and his connection with Hulbert. So come join us the second Tuesday of next month at 8 o'clock. Thank you very much for coming with us. If there's nothing else, I'll wish you all good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.